Welcome to Bench to Bedside, a weekly series of live conversations about recent advances in cancer, from the research bench to treatment at the patient's bedside. And now, your host and the director of the University of Kansas Cancer Center, Dr. Roy Jensen.
There was profound excitement and great optimism for multiple myeloma patients recently when the Federal Food and Drug Administration approved the use of Abecma, a CAR T-cell therapy to treat multiple myeloma that has returned or is unresponsive to treatment. Adding to this, the University of Kansas Cancer Center was the first and only site in the region to offer Abecma CAR T-cell therapy to treat multiple myeloma, a type of blood cancer that affects about 30,000 patients each year. CAR T, or chimeric antigen receptor T-cell, is a form of immunotherapy that works by training a patient's immune system to find and kill cancer cells. It is the latest major advancement in the treatment of multiple myeloma, which claims approximately 13,000 lives each year. Multiple myeloma is the second most common blood cancer diagnosed after non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in the United States. Hi, I'm Dr. Roy Jensen, Director of the University of Kansas Cancer Center. Thanks for joining us for today's episode of Bench to Bedside. With me to talk about the new CAR T-cell therapy are blood and marrow transplant experts, Dr. Abdallah and Dr. Joseph McGuirk, who are both medical oncologists at the University of Kansas Cancer Center. Dr. McGuirk, you're a national leader in the field of CAR T-cell therapy, and our cancer center was among the world's first providers of FDA-approved CAR T-cell therapy for B-cell lymphoma back in 2017. Could you explain for us exactly what CAR T-cell therapy is and how it works?
Yes, absolutely. This is really a paradigm shift in cancer therapeutics, and it's based on our knowledge of the immune system and how the immune system functions normally to fight infection and prevent cancers from ever developing in the first place. The conductors of the orchestra in that immune system are T cells, and T cells are manipulated by cancer cells, as you know, and don't work effectively when they allow cancers to break out and become a clinical problem for our patients. With that knowledge, scientists have taken patients' own T cells to the laboratory, genetically reprogrammed program them to recognize the cancer again, expanded them, take them back to the clinic, and infuse them into the patient like a blood transfusion. Those cells then sweep around the body, attach to the cancer cells, punch a hole in them, release molecules called enzymes that race through those holes and chop up the DNA of the cancer cell and kill it. Really stunning results in lymphoma, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and now multiple myeloma.
That's an incredible story. So Abecma is one of several CAR T-cell therapies that are currently offered for blood cancers. How many different CAR T-cell therapies are there, and why is it important for our cancer center to be among the leaders in offering these new therapeutic approaches?
There's a broad array of CAR T-cell therapies, many different variations and iterations to make these things better and better in patients. Currently in the commercial space, FDA-approved CAR T-cell therapy for a number of types of B-cell non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and then most recently multiple myeloma. But we anticipate many more to come. As you mentioned, we've been on the front end of this in the research sector in our cancer center, leaders in the nation, and first to treat a patient with B-cell lymphoma with the first multi-center, multinational trial CAR T-cell therapy. And that word gets around about a cancer center pretty quickly. And so we've been a source of a lot of focus of pharmaceutical companies and other academic centers in the nation to participate in some of these important clinical trials. Currently, we have 23 active clinical trials looking at different types of cell therapy, many of which are CAR T-cell therapies, in a broad array of cancers, not just blood cancers. The field is moving into solid tumors as well. Very early on, very early days, like it was when we started out in the field with myeloma and lymphoma. Now looking at colon cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer. Very early on, but we're hopeful that this is going to be an effective strategy in those settings as well.
That's incredibly exciting. So, Dr. Abdallah, tell us what is so exciting about this particular CAR T-cell therapy, and why it means so much for multiple myeloma patients?
That's an excellent question. And I think, like a lot of people who actually saw in the news how much the myeloma doctors were very excited about that, there's a major reason for that. For a lot of people to understand in relapsed myeloma, the big challenge that these patients are, always are going to relapse in regards of what treatment they receive. That is the main challenge that we unfortunately see. Having CAR T-cell, like now, it's the first cellular therapy to be approved in multiple myeloma, was a very excitement for a major reason. In the past 3 years, 3 drugs got approved by the FDA in this particular type of patients who have relapsed myeloma. And unfortunately, the response rate were not very exciting for our oncologists. You're talking about a 20 to 30% response rate. Most of these patients have a 2% who achieve the deepest response. And unfortunately, the length of the response was about 3 to 4 months. If I ask any myeloma patient, what do you think about that, they will be very hesitant about receiving that treatment. Talking about the ide-cel or EPCA that got approved via the FDA, we look at 2 things. 1, efficacy, and 2, quality of life. These are 2 important things our relapsed myeloma really look at. If you look at the response in these patients who overall got all the dosage from a lower dose to a higher dose, the response rate was 73% of the patients. And although I'm a physician who don't like to compare origins to apples, but as a myeloma physician, when you're talking about 73% in this particular group of patients, that's also something to highly consider in these patients. Not only that, the majority of these patients stay in remission for 9 months. The percentage of patients who achieve remission was 30%. But if you look deeper, that those who receive the higher dose of the CAR T-cell, which is 450 million cells, they achieve a response rate of 83%. That's really impressive, especially in this group of patients. Not only that, 40% of them got into complete remission, and also the majority of these patients stay in remission over a year. And if you actually achieve complete remission on these 40% of the patient, you can stay in remission over around 20 months. For me as an oncologist, that is really great for the patients. Now that's the efficacy. We go to the quality of life. Any myeloma patient always asks the question, how long you're going to treat me if I go to remission? And unfortunately, when you relapse, you have to be on this treatment as long as you can. It's very difficult to take them off of the treatment because they're likely that they're going to relapse. In CAR T-cell, it's a different story. You get the treatment one time, you go to remission, you live your life, a better quality of life. And I think that really matters a lot for our myeloma patients, to be free of treatment, free of office visit, to come weekly, and free from the side effects that they actually have because of all other treatments that they receive. So it is really a big excitement, and I think it's a really great beginning to have this first cellular therapy approved commercially at KU for the FDA for all myeloma patients.
So, Dr. McGuirk, my understanding is that we were the first cancer center in the world to offer this FDA-approved treatment, and I think that's a real testament to you and your entire team. Can you tell us kind of what goes into being able to offer this to patients first, and
Absolutely.
what the program has done to make that possible?
You bet. We leverage the infrastructure of our very large transplant program to accommodate patients with CAR T-cell therapy. These therapies have toxicities associated with them. They're complex therapies that require the handling of cells and the movement of cells between different centers. And so you have to make sure that you have a large, robust team. We published an article about how to put such a team together that's been a reference for our colleagues around the nation and beyond our own nation, how to deliver safely CAR T-cell therapy and all the parts and pieces that are required to do that. And so we established that reputation very early on when we were involved with the cutting-edge novel trials before any of this was Food and Drug Administration approved. And that caught the notice of pharmaceutical companies around the nation, other academic centers. And so that brought many clinical trials to our own center. And because we did a great job with enrolling patients on studies, doing so safely, and being part of landmark studies like those that you've mentioned already, these companies have come to us when they're ready to roll out after an FDA approval these constructs because they know we're a can-do cancer center, and we can do this. We can do it in a timely manner and in a safe manner for our patients. That's what they're looking for, those types of centers. So oftentimes they'll look for just a handful of centers in the nation as their first sites for therapy. Our performance led them to choose the University of Kansas Cancer Center as the first to be able to treat patients. We actually treated the first 2 patients in the world after FDA approval.
Wow. So Dr. Abdallah, could you tell us about how many multiple myeloma patients we treat every year, and among those patients, what percentage would you say are eligible to receive this new type of therapy?
That's an excellent question. And we have a lot of multiple myeloma patients treatment that we consider like over between 670 to 700 who are in active treatment. The issue here is that defining who are eligible for that. Not everybody is eligible. So, for instance, a patient who is actually in remission on a maintenance therapy, that's not an eligible. We define eligibility about relapsed myeloma. And even the FDA have approved this treatment for relapsed myeloma, there's also different types of relapse. You have to relapse on multiple therapies. And we consider every therapy, a type of what we call line, which is a planned type of therapy that an oncologist provide for the patients. That is one we consider heavily treated patients. Also, another condition is that they have to actually really have been relapsed on 3 different classes of therapy that we consider as the solid treatment for multiple myeloma. These 3 classes we call the triple class refractory. The first one is the immunomodulatory drugs, which is either Revlimid or pomalidomide. The second one is a proteasome inhibitor, which a lot of patients, myeloma patients, are aware about that, called Velcade or pertuzumab. Or carfilzomib, and the oral form of the pertuzumab, which is ixazomib. And the third treatment or class is monoclonal CD38, which is 2 drugs approved by the FDA, the daratumumab and the isatuximab. Patients who got refractory to that are considered eligible for this treatment. Also, a lot of questions have been asked, what if the patient, have received these treatment, did not tolerate that? That's an exception that we make for these patients because, if a patient have a very severe reaction, it doesn't make any sense to give these patients the same treatment. So we always try to look at these cases. So they have to be heavily treated, receive these triple class refractory. Other situations, we always want to make sure that patients are aware about that. We have to have a good performance status. They're active patients. Other things is that to make sure they're not on active dialysis, which we are not sure exactly how safe it is in patients who have kidney failure. We're still learning a little bit more about that. So there's some cases that we, as a group of myeloma physicians here and our bone marrow transplant team, we kind of meet together in order to identify who are eligible, in order to actually select those who are safe to receive the treatment. And that's what our big goal is, to kind of make sure that we give a safe treatment for these patients in order to obtain the best benefit for these myeloma patients.
So Cameron Poindexter, who is joining us via Skype, is here to take your questions, and my understanding is that we already have our first question. So Cameron, fire away.
Yes, the first question is, if a person has been diagnosed with multiple myeloma, how would they know if this new treatment is right for them?
If the person is diagnosed with newly diagnosed myeloma,
yes.
So let me kind of repeat that again for a lot of people to understand that for newly diagnosed myeloma, there is a specific standard of care that this CAR T cell is only available for those who relapse after they got the diagnosis of myeloma and they fail multiple lines. However, there is some clinical trials that we have available that we are also planning to open for newly diagnosed myeloma. So if you're a newly diagnosed myeloma, for commercial CAR T cell, you're not eligible for that. If it's a clinical trial, you might be eligible for that.
Yes, and if I can just add to that, Dr. Abdallah, these studies, these approvals of these CAR T cells in patients with the most advanced, heavily pretreated therapy is oftentimes where drugs, or in this case cell therapy, start out. Once they prove their muster and their worth in that setting, it raises the question of, do we need to wait until patients are that far down the line? If they're effective in the most severe, worst of circumstances, perhaps they'll be even more effective if we move them up in our armamentarium earlier in the therapy of patients. And that's what Dr. Abdallah is overseeing in terms of clinical trials at our center, as are a number of other investigators, as I mentioned, in solid tumors, other types of blood cancers, moving these therapies up sooner and sooner. And we're seeing some very early signals that may be a highly effective strategy. The jury's out yet, but we have a lot of hope that will be the case.
So, is there value in combining traditional therapies with CAR T? Does CAR T work better if the patient has had chemotherapy and kind of knocked down the cancer, or are we still trying to figure all that out?
That's a really great question, Dr. Jensen, and we are still trying to figure all of that out. What is the best context to employ these? One of the studies that we're participating in is an autologous stem cell transplant followed by CAR T cell therapy, with the idea that intensive chemotherapy will knock them down to a low level, as you suggested, and make it easier for the CAR T to come in and sweep up whatever is left over, and hopefully provide for long-term remissions and, God willing, someday curative therapy, which we're seeing in lymphomas already. Patients beyond 4 years in continued complete remission who are resistant to all forms of chemotherapy previously. In addition, for those patients who don't respond, it raises scientific questions. Why did this patient not respond and another patient did respond to CAR T cell therapy? And understanding that biology will allow us to leverage that information and attack the cells. One example is the molecule they attack on the surface. The myeloma, the cancer cell, will shed that so that it can't be seen by the CAR T cells. Well, there's a protein enzyme that can actually be blocked that will prevent them from shedding that, so that they're more susceptible to the cancer, to the CAR T cell, killing the cancer cell. And so we're very much involved in these types of studies.
So one analogy that I think we might use is, your team may have a great running back, which is CAR T therapy, but it needs a good offensive line to kind of clear the way and have that running back be effective. So
that's exactly right. That's a great analogy.
Yeah. So, Cameron, it looks like we have another question.
Yes, the second question is, how do you start the process to be evaluated for this treatment? And also, what does the treatment process look like?
Dr. Abdallah, you want to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the process is that we always evaluate these patients. We review all the cases. Again, this is a commercial CAR T cell, which means like we have to go for that the patient has been relapsed on all the treatments. He's refractory to the three classes of the treatment. And then we go through the same process about evaluating how's the patient clinically look like in terms of his lungs, cardiac workup, and all these stuff, in order for us to evaluate if the patient is eligible for that. These are the major things. And after that, of course, we have what we call submitting this to the insurance, and that's something our team work all together in order to get this approved. And once it's approved, then we evaluate the date that the patient is going to come here to the KU Medical Center in order to get the apheresis to the cells, and that is the date that we get determined by the pharmaceutical company that will give us that date. And between the time that the cells are going to get processed and engineered till the time they're going to receive the CAR T cell, there's a 4 to 6 weeks. We usually evaluate these patients if they need some kind of treatment to keep their disease under control, and that's something we always work as a group, us and the cellular therapy team, in order to keep the myeloma under control until they receive their CAR T cell at that time.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. McGuirk, what is it about multiple myeloma that makes it such a challenge to treat?
These cancers are smart, and so they figure out ways to circumvent and escape our traditional chemotherapy drugs. And again, men and women in laboratories across the world, including in our own cancer center, seek and invest a great deal of time and energy in figuring out what those mechanisms are. How do they escape the effects of our therapies, including CAR T cell therapy? And as we understand that biology better, human beings are smart too. And so we come up with new torpedoes to target those specific pathways that they're using to escape. But it takes time. As you know, it takes many years and a lot of support in a cancer center like our own to unravel these pathways and go after them. But unravel them we are. Another escape mechanism, for example, in myeloma from CAR T cell therapy is that the T cells that we're collecting from the patient and re-engineering genetically may not be the healthiest T cells because they allowed the patient to get cancer in the first place. and they've been treated with chemotherapy. They get, as a bystander effect, some damage from the chemotherapy that we treat our patients with. So some of the studies that we're exploring, including in multiple myeloma, are using a normal healthy 18-year-old's T cells, genetically engineering them and using them in our patients. Now that presents some real challenges, but with the development of gene editing and gene engineering, which brought about the awarding of the Nobel Prize this past October to 2 women, an American and French investigators, with that new technology, we can do things to a normal healthy donor that allow those cells to be accepted by the patient and to do the killing and persist. So a lot of exciting things going on to figure out how to get around these resistant mechanisms that these cancer cells come up with.
Cameron, I understand we have another question.
Yes. The third question is, in a clinical trial, what are the expenses that a patient is personally responsible for?
Well, I mean, I usually refer to the team. Usually have a great supportive financials team that will actually go ahead and inform the patient about the personal response. The majority of the clinical trials also have some what we call travel expenses that the sponsor actually provided for the patients. But it really depends on what clinical trials these patients are going to be enrolled on. So we always try to help the patients to understand exactly the financial situation prior to enrollment in the clinical trials.
So one thing I would add to that is a general principle is that for any experimental aspects of the treatment, that's always covered. More routine things which are done for the patients during the course of their trial, that is usually covered by insurance. In fact, we worked awfully hard to make sure that the insurance here in Kansas, the insurance companies do cover routine aspects of clinical care while patients are on clinical trial. Cameron, understand that we have yet another question.
Yes. Do you need a referral to be seen, or can I schedule my own appointment?
Well, I think referral, or patients have the right also to have self-referral. We're more than happy. I believe that patients have the right to be evaluated and discuss with us about that. Not only for commercial CAR T cell, also for availability of clinical trials. So if a patient are interested, we try to evaluate if they're eligible for any of our clinical trials for CAR T cells. So that is something I really believe. So I highly encourage my oncologist colleagues, always to try to refer the patient earlier, because as I talked to Dr. McGuirk, although these patients are heavily treated myeloma patients, and this is something unfortunately is bad about the myeloma. Every time you relapse, there's a lower chance you're going to respond to the next treatment and a shorter duration of response. So we try to see these patients a little bit earlier, because the process of evaluating these patients take a while, and we want to try to make sure that these patients are under our radar in order to get them a slot available for the commercial CAR T cell. I think that's very important, very significant right now, especially the timing. We don't want to wait till that we don't have any other options, and patient usually with that type of myeloma, they usually have very bad end organ damage, and that might impact their quality or eligibility to receive the CAR T cell.
And if I may just comment on that, patient self-referral is very common in our cancer center. We're a National Cancer Institute designated cancer center, and have folks like Dr. Abdallah who are completely focused on myeloma. Dr. Abdallah wouldn't know what to do with a lung cancer patient. No offense intended, Dr. Abdallah, or colon cancer. His life and his work and his research is focused on multiple myeloma, and that's the case for his entire team. And essentially every aspect of cancer in our cancer center is geared in that direction. We're all very subspecialized and focused in those areas and run those clinical trials. And so many patients self-refer, or they seek a second opinion in our center. It's always a wise move to get more information, become better educated, so you can make a well-informed decision. And oftentimes there are clinical trials available at an NCI-designated cancer center that would not be available at many of our high-quality community hospitals throughout our state, our city, et cetera. And so I strongly encourage people, if they have questions, we're available. That's what we do. We serve our patients and their needs.
I would add to that multiple myeloma is a great example in that over the last 15 years, it's stunning the number of new treatments that have come out for that disease and the amount of progress that has been made in extending people's lives. Notice I didn't say cure multiple myeloma, but we've made great progress in extending people's lives. And I think the Abecma therapy is just kind of the at the forefront of a whole host of new types of cellular therapy that are going to be applied to this disease. And when you take the combination of all the new drugs that have come out, and I'm very proud of the role that KU has played in bringing some of those drugs online, but I think the future for multiple myeloma is really extraordinarily bright in terms of the patients that get that disease. And I think we're just sort of kind of scratching at the possibilities there. So it's
No doubt.
It's a great story.
No doubt about that.
Cameron, I understand we have another question.
Yes, if a person is being treated somewhere else, can they get a second opinion at our cancer center to see if they qualify for this treatment?
Absolutely, yes. That's a common reason we see patients is for second opinions and consideration of clinical trial participation. Certainly, Dr. Abdallah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that's one of the common things is that patients come for a second opinion to discuss about their current treatment or if there's any availability for clinical trials, and we're always happy to see these patients, and we're always available anytime to see these patients.
So, Dr. McGuirk, what would you most like our listeners to take away with them after today's session?
It's an extraordinarily hopeful time for our patients with cancer in general, and certainly for our patients with multiple myeloma. Cutting-edge research. The survival for patients with multiple myeloma has more than quadrupled since I started in the field over 30 years ago. I've always been excited, as our other speakers have been today, about the prospects for our patients in effective therapy, better quality of life, less toxic therapies throughout my entire career. But I am more excited about the promising therapies today than ever before. It's really an extraordinary time, a lot of gee whiz science that's going on that's translating into meaningful, improved outcomes for our patients. So maintain your hope. Don't be shy about getting a second opinion, and think about the broad array of clinical trials available to you in an NCI-designated cancer center like the University of Kansas Cancer Center.
All right. Well, I want to thank you and Dr. Abdallah. That's it for today. To learn more, please visit https://www.kucancercenter.org/CAR-T. Join us next time for Bench to Bedside. Thanks for watching.